Good morning. By now, you have discovered that I'm out of town and preparing this presentation in advance. I hope everyone's well today and ready to learn some developmental psychology. This is the second half of our developmental chapter. Professor Michael Kukin, I suspect, is sitting in with us today, and he'll be able to help you with any questions that you have. He's a professor who teaches this course as well. So, today we have 3 lessons to learn. The first one is Jean Piaget's studies in cognitive development. So I'm going to introduce you to those ideas today. The second one, and a related idea, is Lawrence Kohlberg's work with moral development. So moral reasoning goes hand in hand with cognitive development. Finally, we're going to talk about parenting styles. That is, the methods that parents use to raise children and how that affects their development. So we'll begin with Jean Piaget and cognitive development. Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, and that's why we say Piaget. The G is soft. You should learn how to say that. It isn't Piaget or Piaget, it's Piaget. For those of you who are interested in the subject, here's an excellent book in your library, The Essential Piaget, and I encourage you to take a look at it in case you need more information someday for a paper or presentation that you may do. All right, Piaget was very interested in children's cognitive development. So when we think about his subject matter, cognition, in many respects we're thinking about intelligence. And we've already had a chapter on intelligence, but in that section we were looking at intelligence in terms of defining it and quantitatively, that is, measuring it. In this discussion, we're going to look at intelligence qualitatively. That is to say, the qualities of normal intelligence at different ages and how they develop over time. So Piaget used the observational method in learning about children's developing intelligence. He thought of children as little experimenters because he noticed that they are constantly moving about and inquiring into their world and sampling things around them. He noticed that children have 2 big cognitive tasks, 2 huge cognitive tasks. The first one is to label every object on Earth. That's pretty big. And the second is to organize these objects into families of related objects. To do that requires a great deal of experimentation and effort on the child's part. There are some key terms which you'll have to learn in order to understand Piaget. The first one is schema, S-C-H-E-M-A. A schema is a mental representation. They can be simple or complicated. When I say mental representation, what I mean is, if I say to you, ice cream cone, something like this appears in your mind, this image of an ice cream cone. The image in your mind mentally represents the ice cream cone in the real world. So schemas can be simple, like this ice cream cone, or they can be very complicated. For example, we have mental maps for how to get from one place to another, from your home to Valencia, for example, or from the parking lot to the classroom. And these mental maps are schemas, some of them quite complicated. But it can even be more complicated than that. We have schemas for gender, what it means to be a man or a woman. And these gender schemas are very complex, and they really regulate our behavior. When we are behaving consistently with our gender schema for masculinity or femininity, we feel good, we feel normal. When our behavior drifts away from what we consider to be appropriate male or female behavior, we feel uncomfortable, and we quickly shift back to the prescribed behavior from that particular schema. Two more terms: assimilate and accommodate. So these terms help us understand how schemas are formed. Do you think we're born with schemas, or do you think we're born pretty much blank and acquire schemas through exposure to the world? If you said acquire them, you're right. We're born with no schemas at all. What do you think might be the first schema that babies develop? Well, there'll be some time to talk about this at the end, but if you said the mother schema, you're probably right. Babies develop a mental representation of their mother by a year and a half or so, maybe sooner. All right, so after we have developed some basic schemas, we begin to categorize objects, new objects that we encounter, by placing them in the schemas that we have already, the existing schemas. And this process is called assimilation. Assimilate. Think about the root word. If you said similar, you're right. So when we use assimilation to organize our thinking about the world, we are categorizing new objects based on their similarity to schemas we have already established. So, a good example of schemas might be a child who has a dog. The dog is a beagle. Black and white, long ears, 4 legs, long tail. Doggy. That's his doggy schema. And then he meets a friend or visits a friend, and that friend has a dog too, but it's a German Shepherd. It looks different. Naturally, he will assign the same word, doggy, to the German Shepherd. He will categorize them using similarities. He will assimilate. Assimilation alone is insufficient because we would have too simple of a worldview. And that we can't have. As we age, we begin to recognize the complexity of the world, and we need to create a mental model of that complexity. This is where the next term, accommodation, comes into play. To accommodate means to make adjustments in our schema pattern to account for significant differences between an object we've recently encountered and our existing schemas. A good example would be the little boy who has the beagle. 4 legs, long tail, big ears, black and white. He's riding with his mother in a car, and they pass a meadow, and across the meadow is a cow. 4 legs, long tail, big ears, black and white. Doggy, says the little kid. And the mom says, no, moo cow. The little boy looks at the animal again. 4 legs, long tail, big ears, black and white. Doggy. So he has assimilated the cow into the doggy schema. One day, Mom drives out to the farm, and the cow walks up to the fence, and they park the car, and the cow sticks his nose in the window, and Junior is mortified. Clearly, this is not Doggy. This thing is huge. It's got a big stinky tongue. It's gigantic. It has horns on its head. He looks at his mom. She says, moo cow. He looks back and says, moo cow. So think about what happened there. He had to change his schema structure. Now it is more complex and a better representation of the real world around us. So he used accommodation. He accommodated the differences between the cow and the dog, even though from the distance they looked very similar. All right, so we've learned schema, a mental representation, assimilation, which is to categorize based on similarities, and accommodation, which is a modification of our schema structure to accommodate the differences in new objects. Piaget argued that we have to have roughly an equal balance in our use of assimilation and accommodation. But people will take the simplest cognitive solution that they can find. So we tend to use assimilation as long as we can. And a point comes where the nervous system has matured to the extent that it can do more advanced thinking. And the old schema structure is inadequate. It's too simple. And a revolution in how we think occurs. Each one of these changes he called a stage of cognitive development, and there are 4. You see them on the board before you. What I want you to remember, what I'm going to hold you accountable for, is the name of each stage, the age range, and the test that Piaget used to show when a child has accomplished the tasks necessary for that stage and switched into the next. I've provided you with some notes to fill in and some charts which will help you organize your thinking. And you'll notice that there's a little chart that says stage, age range, and test for successful completion. So that's what I would like you to fill in as we continue with this discussion. So the first stage is the sensory motor stage, and that occurs between birth and age 2. The second stage is pre-operational, and that occurs between age 2 and age 7. The third stage is the concrete stage, and that occurs between age 7 and 11. And finally is formal operations, which is the final stage of development that lasts from somewhere in the teen years into adulthood. As we proceed through Piaget's stages, you should try to learn the name of each stage, get it logged into your memory, the age range for each one, and the test for successful completion. Now, we'll go ahead and elaborate on each of these stages. Hopefully, the additional information will make more sense of these stages and make them easier for you to remember. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. Let's think about that term, sensory motor. It really has two elements, doesn't it? Sensation and motor, which in biology always means movement. Sensation and movement. So this particular period is a little bit hard to envision because you can't remember it in your own life. So we have to make inferences about it from observing children who are 2 years or younger. And if you do observe a child 2 years or younger, you're going to notice two things. They are moving about. That's the motor part. Crawling or walking throughout, almost continuously when they're awake. And many times they're moving in order to get to an object that they want to explore more. This is why when we have a child this young, we have to safety-proof the house, because children would be delighted to swig some bleach from under the sink or tear your books or CDs out and throw them all over the house. So we have to reorganize to make the house safe for the child. The sensation part means that the child has no language and can only know the world through sensing objects in it. So, what are the senses? Vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, but no language. So in this stage of development, we can't remember it because we would probably need language to encode the meaning of what happens to us, and we don't have language in this stage. So the child can only know an object if he can, in some way, sense it, touch it, or taste it, or smell it, or heft the thing. But when the object is not in his sensual field, to him it doesn't exist anymore. That's a hard idea to grasp. If he cannot sense the object, it no longer exists so far as he knows. Can you imagine why that might be? If you thought that's because he has no schemas for these objects, no mental representations, you are correct. He cannot symbolically represent the world around him, so he can only know them through his senses. All right, some examples. When I lived in Vermont, I had a friend who was an old woman who loved to garden, and she got too old to dig her garden in spring, so I would go over and do it for her. And one day I was working on her garden, and she had some guests, including a little boy who was about 1.5 years or so. And he came out and was watching me, and he did what little kids will do in a setting like that, which was play in the dirt, pick up clumps and throw them. And he found an earthworm. And I saw him study that worm in his hand, and as I watched him, boom, and he just stood there with that worm in his mouth. So that's an example of sensory motor behavior. He touched it, learned about it, it was wiggly, tasted it, what did it taste like, and so on. A similar example, I was helping a friend put up a Christmas tree. It was a big tree, so I was holding the thing stationary, and he was underneath tightening up the stand at the base, and I looked over and saw the little boy. He found the Christmas balls, and he picked one up and smashed it on the floor, and it was like, whoa, that's what they're for. And he was smashing one after another. And in that example, you see cause and effect. When you toss the ball on the floor, it explodes, makes a popping sound, and creates sparkles all over. And he had a look on his face like, oh, that's what these are for. My little daughter, Morgan, when she was a baby, she discovered she could sneak up on the cat, grab it by the tail and pull the tail, and the cat would consistently make this funny face, putting his ears back and making this crazy sound and clawing at the floor to get away from her. She thought it was hilarious. So here you see sensory motor behavior. Particularly of interest is the cause and effect pattern that babies are learning. during this sensory motor period. Finally, the cat got wise and wouldn't let her catch him. All right, so the sensory motor period, 0 to 2. Now, the test that I was talking about is called object permanence. So, remember, at this period of life, the child can only know an object if he can sense it. If it's not available to his senses, if it's out of range, he can't hear it or see it or smell it or touch it or taste it, it doesn't exist so far as he can tell. At a certain point, the child begins to develop sufficient number of schemas so that he has this revolution of thought. His nervous system has matured, he's had enough exposure to life, and he starts to realize, wow, objects exist even when I can't see them. Moms still exist. The mother schema is probably the first one. I can't see her, but she's probably out in the kitchen where she likes to go after I go to bed. When children develop object permanence, the realization that objects exist even though they can't sense them, they like certain games. For example, peekaboo. My little Morgan loved this game where she would bring a beach towel and she would walk up to me and stand there and hold the towel up in front of her face. And I was supposed to say, "Where's Morgan? She's gone. I can't find her." And she would be cracking up. And when she couldn't stand it anymore, she'd pull the towel down with this big old grin. It was like, "I've been here the whole time, you dumb shit." When we put the baby in the crib, hand them a toy, and they have attained object permanence, they love to throw the toy over the side and stand there grinning because they know it's down there and you are going to get it for them and return it to them. And when you do, they pitch it over the side again and they crack up. Hilarious. All right, I'm going to show you a video which illustrates object permanence, or lack of, actually, object permanence. The mother will show the baby a toy and take it away, and notice the expression on the baby's face. It's as though, "Toy? What toy?" All right, you saw an example of a child who has not yet attained object permanence. There's a picture of a child in your book where the child is looking at a toy elephant. Then the experimenter puts a paper between the elephant and the baby, and the baby looks away as though, "Toy? What toy?" What do you think that child would have done if he had object permanence? If you guessed he would try to reach behind the paper and grab the toy, you are right. All right. Once object permanence has been attained, then the child has shifted into the second stage of development, which is the preoperational stage. So the preoperational stage occurs between ages 2 and 7. Now, if I were you, I would want to know what that word operation means, because whatever it means, this child is incapable of doing it. They are pre-operational. All right, so let me explain. An operation means a mental rule of thumb. Common forms of logic that we use in our daily lives, such as adding or subtracting, or forming correct syntax in a sentence, or syllogistic logic. Obviously, no 2-year-old is capable of any of those things. They are pre-operational. So they have developed language. A 2-year-old, of course, can't speak. So it's safe to say that pre-operational is a child who has language but no logic. Language but no logic. Now, what kind of thinking would someone do who has language but no logic? Well, we have a name for that. It's called magical thinking. Magical thinking basically means anything could happen. Anything is possible. For example, it's possible that there's a fat man in a red suit who comes down the chimney of every kid in the world simultaneously at midnight on December 24th and gives good toys to good kids. Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, these are all possible because of magical thinking. Language without logic. There are other qualities of magical thought that Piaget has identified, and these you see on the screen before you. Egocentrism. Now, if we refer to an adult as being egocentric, we're saying that he is unpleasant, that he's immature, that he's focused on himself or conceited. But that is not what Piaget meant, and that's not what we mean when we refer to little children in the pre-operational stage. Egocentrism simply means the child, lacking logic, explains events in his life in terms of his own needs and wishes. That's all he's got to go on. Allow me to give you an example. If I ask a little child of this pre-operational stage, why is the sun shining today? Well, he doesn't know about the heliocentric theory of the universe or meteorology, so he thinks about it and he realizes, oh, I know, it's sunny because I'm going to the beach. That's egocentrism. Animism means that to a child, inanimate objects could have lifelike qualities. So you have to be careful what you say about teddy bear or how you treat Dolly, because you don't want to hurt their feelings. We often hear the expression, the man in the moon. Well, in a way, that harkens back to our period of pre-operational thought. It looks like a face on the moon. Artificialism simply means that children in the pre-operational stage have not yet learned the difference between man-made materials and those which are naturally occurring. So these are examples of pre-operational thinking. Now, when a child concludes this stage and has matured sufficiently to take on more complicated forms of cognition, thinking, he has developed what we call conservation, to conserve. So you'll see the definition of conservation on the slides before you. Conservation means that we can change one quality of an object while the object retains its other qualities. So the classic example of conservation is conservation of volume. And you see the diagram on the screen before you. Two glasses, both of which have the same amount of fluid. The researcher pours one of those glasses into a taller glass, thinner glass, and asks the child which one has more. The child who has not yet attained conservation will pick one. They might think the tall one has more, or maybe the short one has more. But the child who has attained conservation understands they're equal. Even though you change the shape of the water column, you did not alter the volume of fluid in the glass. I'm going to show you a video in which children who have not yet attained conservation and children who have are being tested for conservation. Let's watch.
Can you look at these two glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice, this glass has more juice, or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more, and why do you think that this one has more?
Because it's taller.
So first we're going to look at these two cups right here. Do you think there's the same amount of juice in this glass as there is in that glass?
They're even.
They're even? Okay. So we're going to take the juice from this glass and pour it into this one right here.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to look at this glass and that one. So do you think that there's more juice in this glass, more juice in this glass, or do you think that they have the same amount?
Same amount.
Okay, why do you think that they have the same amount?
Just because this is skinny doesn't mean it's not the same amount. It has the same amount of juice in it, but this one is just wider and this one's skinnier, but they have the same amount of juice in it.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or do they have the same?
1, 2, 3. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're both the same.
They're the same?
5, 5.
Okay. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more, or do they have the same?
This one has more.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does this row have more quarters?
Because it's more far away.
It's more far away?
Yeah, it's more far away than that. Looks bigger.
All right, we're going to play a game with the graham crackers, and we're going to share them between me and you, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Do you think that we shared those fairly?
No.
No, why not?
You have those and I have this one.
Well, what if we try this? Okay, can I put this down right there?
Okay.
Now is it fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, why is it fair now?
Because we both have two.
In that video, you saw the conservation of volume, which I've also described, but you also saw the conservation of number, where the little girl confused the length of the line with the number of quarters in the line. And you also saw the conservation of mass, where the little girl thought breaking the cracker in half made it equal to the woman who had 2 crackers. All right. When the child attains conservation, they have entered into a period called concrete thinking. Concrete thinking occurs between 7 and 11 years of age. A concrete thinker is a literal thinker. Concrete means literal. So, a concrete thinker takes you at your word. You have to use plain language with concrete thinkers. They do not understand analogy or metaphor or simile. It doesn't make a lot of sense to them. However, they have attained logic. So now, during the concrete period, you have a child who has both language and logic and is ready for school. At school, they begin to learn more advanced ideas, logical ideas, such as reversibility. The way you put something together is reversed in taking it apart. So, children are ready for classroom programming. Now, the test for the completion of this phase, concrete operations, is called abstract thinking. So, really, adults have 2 types of thinking: concrete, which is literal, or abstract, which is the capacity to talk about one thing in terms of another. It's a very common analogy to say time is money. So what does that mean? Time is money. Think about it. If you thought it means that time is valuable, you're right. But that is an analogy, and it requires the ability to think abstractly. We're talking about time in terms of money. And this is formal operations. This is adult logic. So we really build our understanding of the world in terms of abstract thought as adults. For example, if time is money, we can buy time. We can make time. We can save time. We can spend time. So you see how that simple analogy, time is money, fans out into an entire logic system, a way of understanding the world in adulthood. This we call formal operations. So that's all we have to say about Piaget today, though you'll have some time at the end to talk about these ideas and see if you can develop them in your own thinking a little bit better. Next, we're going to go to lesson 2, which is called moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is a study of the way we make judgments about what's right and wrong. And as you can imagine, as we age, the methods we use to determine what is morally correct become much more complex. And as you'll see as we go through the logic here, morality begins external to the child. That is, the child is incapable of moral reasoning and instead refers to the adults that he reports to, such as his parent or a teacher or the pastor. That's called social referencing. What would my dad do? What would my mom want me to do? And gradually, as we proceed through life, many people develop an internal moral compass, the capacity to make solid, reliable moral judgments based on their own inner sense of right and wrong. So morality goes from external to internal. The famous name in the study of moral reasoning is Lawrence Kohlberg. Many more researchers have come along subsequent to Kohlberg, but this is a very good place for you to start. And once you understand Kohlberg's ideas, then you'll be able to understand the criticisms and the more contemporary lines of reasoning. Interestingly, Kohlberg was a student of Piaget's. And Piaget started the study of moral reasoning, but he got old and retired. And Kohlberg, who by then was employed by Harvard Medical College, and he continued the research using Piaget's basic ideas. So let's learn a little bit about moral reasoning. First of all, we're going to have to learn some new words. So here's one for you. This is dilemma. Perhaps you know what that term means. Maybe you have heard of a dilemma. If you're thinking a dilemma is a problem, you're right. But it's a special problem. It's one which has no satisfying solution. You are forced to make a choice, in this case a moral choice, between two undesirable possibilities. So, in trying to understand the way people think through moral dilemmas, Piaget invented a moral dilemma which Kohlberg ultimately used. And here it is. It's called The Story of Heinz. Heinz was a man whose wife was dying of cancer. And he discovered that a pharmacist in his village had created a form of radium that could cure the tumor and save his wife. But Heinz couldn't afford the medicine, and the man would not bargain with him. Now, stop and think. That left Heinz in a dilemma. He had two choices. What were they? If you're thinking he could steal the drug and save his wife, or let his wife die, you're right. That's the dilemma. It's not nice to let your wife die, and it is not nice to steal medicines. So children of every age were asked, what should Heinz do? And of course, Kohlberg wasn't concerned with whether they thought he should steal or not steal. Kohlberg was interested in the logic they employed to reach their conclusion. So, another term we've got to learn is convention. And if you understand this term, convention, this lesson will be very easy to learn. Now, the term convention means a standard or widely accepted rule governing our conduct. The way something is usually done in a given culture. That is what we mean by a convention. So conventions vary by culture, and they have to be learned. So there's a conventional stage of logic, and what we hear people sometimes say is conventional wisdom, what most people believe to be true. If there is a conventional stage, as you can imagine, there must be a pre-conventional stage, a time before which the person does not understand the conventions of his culture. He hasn't learned them yet. And there could be a period after a person has learned the conventions of his culture in which he is capable of even more advanced moral reasoning. Let's call that post-conventional, after the conventions have been learned. So, now we have three major stages, but these Kohlberg had to subdivide into two stages each. The first stage of moral reasoning is referred to as an obedience-punishment orientation. And what that means is when the child is presented with a moral dilemma, they socially reference a parent. They think, what would my dad want me to do? And they want to do what their parent would like. They want to obey what the parent has taught them. And they want to avoid punishment. So the first stage is referred to as obedience-punishment orientation. Soon after that, the children began to think a little bit more egocentrically. Remember Piaget? Egocentrism. And this stage has been referred to as the stage of mutuality. Now, mutual, what does that word mean? If you thought mutual means I do for you and you do for me, you're correct. So, the child who is in this stage of mutuality, and here's the Heinz dilemma, might think something like, well, Heinz should steal the drug and save his wife. And you say, what makes you think that? And the child says, well, because if Heinz saves his wife's life, she might save his someday. It's mutual. The next stage, and the first one in conventional reasoning, is referred to as interpersonal expectations. So really, I think of it as honoring role obligations. So by the time a person has learned the conventions of their culture, they have assumed certain roles. And that is certainly the case with Heinz. If we stop and think about Heinz, we don't know much about him, but we can easily identify two roles that Heinz occupied. Can you think of one? If you thought husband, you're certainly right. Perhaps you didn't think of it this way, but he was also a citizen of a country. And that's a role too, and that is one that some people take very seriously. Husband and citizen. Now, when presented with the Heinz dilemma, it depends on which role he takes most seriously, and you'll see right away how powerful this logic is. Imagine if he thinks the husband role is the most important role, that a husband should do anything to protect his wife, including take a bullet or go to jail. What's he going to do? Right, he is going to steal the drug. Now, what if he feels that citizenship surpasses the husband role in importance? Well, good citizens cannot steal medicine. That would be a wholesale breakdown in society. It would be chaos. And so, in that case, he would have to let his wife die. The next level, I often think of as a law and order orientation. Now here, you're going to hear echoes of concrete thinking. The law and order orientation simply means that you ask yourself, what does the law say? And that's what we're going to do. Literal, concrete, straightforward, whatever the law says. And sometimes you might hear a conversation between a teenager and his parent, and the child is saying that, yes, he did smoke marijuana, and the parent is saying, you're never going to do that again, and the kid's saying, but why, Dad? It ought to be legal. And the dad may say, well, perhaps it ought to be, but it isn't. So you're going to mind the law. That is a law and order orientation. There isn't a whole lot of logic in it. We simply have to know the laws. And as it turns out, ignorance is not a legal defense. Every law says you knew or should have known that such and such is illegal. So if you say to the judge, I didn't know that was illegal, the judge will say, tough shit, here's your fine. Now, post-conventional reasoning means that somebody has developed the capacity to sort through difficult moral issues with greater acuity and clarity than most people can. They're thinking for themselves, not in the sense of breaking the law for their own gain, but holding to what they believe to be right, despite pressures sometimes to conform. Here we can think of Rosa Parks, who sat in the front of the bus because she'd worked hard and was tired and felt it was reasonable for her to sit there, even though she broke a law which I would argue deserved to be broken. You could think of this as a person who can distinguish between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So think for a moment, what do you think the letter of the law refers to? If you were thinking, it means the exact wording of the law, as in concrete thinking, you were right. Now, you may have noticed that it is extremely difficult to write a law that is correct in every situation. It's very hard to do. And arguably, there are times when we should overlook a law to prevent a worse catastrophe. So, the person who reaches this stage of logic is able to think about the spirit of the law. Now, that means, what did the law intend? Every law is written to solve a problem or create an effect. So what was it that that law was designed to do? Now, I'm going to give you a very simple-minded example, because it's easy to understand and it's clear. But rarely is this stage of logic simple or clear. Imagine you're walking down the street and you look across a couple of yards and you can see a child struggling in a pool. It looks like the child is drowning. Well, you know that it's illegal to trespass, to jump over those fences and run through those yards. But you're going to choose to break the trespass law to save that child, because your reasoning would be the trespass laws are there to prevent and destruction of property, to protect private property, and that's good. But you are not going to damage the person's property. You're going to break the trespass law in order to save a child. Letting the child drown was not part of the design of the law. So that is an example of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Finally, there's a stage of development which is possible to attain, but Kohlberg found very few people who have ever attained it. I don't think he had anybody in the contemporary world. He certainly couldn't find enough research subjects to learn much about it. But he called this universal moral principles. So you might be asking, what the heck is a universal moral principle? Well, our country is founded on universal moral principles. These are the super high standards which are enshrined in the Constitution, which admittedly our country struggles to live up to. But they're set there as standards for us to try to achieve. Liberty is an example. It's understood that people should have the right of liberty, the freedom to make choices for themselves and to move about as they wish. The sanctity of human life. It's better to affect solutions without killing people. The pursuit of happiness. You have a right to enjoy this one and only life that you have been granted. Human dignity. People are different than other creatures. We're imbued with a spirit, with a will and a capacity to enjoy the beauty of this world. Equality, justice, these are post-conventional forms of reasoning. All right, so Kohlberg couldn't find many people in the contemporary world who illustrated this sixth stage universal moral principle. So he referred to people by biography, people from the past. Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa. He said these are people whose moral sense was the strongest moral sense that humans are capable of developing. All right, we have one lesson left to go, and that has to do with parenting and parenting styles. So this is Diana Baumrind, that's the famous name. She began her research in the 1960s, where there were raging debates about whether parents should be permissive with their children or strict, and there were opinions flying everywhere, but very little science. Perhaps you've heard of Dr. Spock, who wrote the child care manual that was so wildly popular in the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 80s. You can take a look at the electronic copies of articles on our library, and you'll find several of the most excellent articles written by Diana Baumrind. This is her 1966 article, The Effects of Authoritative Parental Control on Children. I urge you to have a look and download a copy for yourself for future use. All right. So, Diana Baumrind began her research by looking at what we already knew. And what we knew is, first of all, this hot topic issue, parenting. Nobody wants to be told how to parent. Could be measured. And as you also know, everything in science must be measurable. If it cannot be measured, it is not science. And she was determined to take a scientific approach. So she discovered that there are two dimensions by which we can measure how a parent goes about doing the parenting job. So the first of these two measures is responsiveness, sometimes referred to as warmth or understanding. So as you can imagine, a parent must know what's going on in their child's life and know what the child needs and try in some way to meet those needs. That's the responsiveness part, identifying a need and responding to it. At the same time, it's ideal for the parent to behave in a warm or loving way. Not all parents do. Not all parents are responsive. Not all parents are warm or loving. So we wind up with a continuum of warm, responsive parenting and cold, unresponsive parenting, and everybody else in the middle. The second dimension is that of control. So it is true that parents must be in charge. The parent must assert parental authority and must train the child to accept parental authority. The parent must be in charge. If the kids are in charge, all hell breaks loose and all kinds of things go wrong. So some parents make an effort to exert reasonable control, and we could call that limit setting. Limit setting for children. Other parents do not want to do the hard work of setting limits, of controlling their kids. And then there's another group who over-control their children. They want to dictate everything that child will do, and the child has the opportunity to make few decisions of their own. So we see a second continuum between appropriate levels of control and no control or excessive control, one way or the other, and everybody else in the middle. If we use these two dimensions, we can identify 4 parenting styles. And here they are on the screen before you. So a parent who makes little attempt to control a child and is not very responsive or loving would be called a permissive, indifferent parent. Let's think about those terms. Permissive, anything goes, giving permission to do whatever they want as long as they don't do it here. Indifferent means, who cares what happens? You'll learn the hard way. Permissive, indifferent. Cold, and no appropriate limit set. There could be a person who is highly responsive and loving and really cares about their kid, but still can't say no. And that we would call a permissive, indulgent parent. So this is the parent who wants to give everything to their child and who can't say no. They have difficulty setting limits because they want so desperately to give their kid everything. The permissive, indifferent parent is not doing the entire parenting job. They're doing half, aren't they? They're doing the loving, responsive part, but not the difficult job of limit setting. So we could have a third combination, which would be an adult who is low in responsiveness. They're not very responsive to their child. They're not very warm either. They don't show love and affection to their kids, but they exert very high levels of control. Now that we would call an authoritarian. An authoritarian is a dictator. And they judge their own parenting performance in terms of how obedient their child is. This is the parent who wants to bark a command and watch that child jump up and immediately obey. And then they feel all is well in their homes. These are the parents who often talk about military-type discipline and so forth. The fourth and final combination is somebody who is highly responsive and establishes control. So they're doing the entire parenting job. In my practice, when I treated families and tried to train them in this, I would tell them love and limits, warmth and responsiveness, and high levels of reasonable control. This is the parenting job. So this fourth and final type of parenting style is referred to as authoritative. Now, those two words, authoritarian and authoritative, sound so similar, and they have exactly the opposite meanings. So I'm going to help you with a tool for remembering which one's which. Think of authoritative as positive parenting. Notice, positive and authoritative both have T-I-V-E at the end. If you remember that, positive, authoritative, T-I-V-E, you'll never get it wrong, you'll always get it right. So, Baumrind, after she identified these parenting styles and developed a way of measuring them in real live parents, conducted a longitudinal study, many longitudinal studies actually, to identify what are the consequences of each parenting style on the children. Remember, this began as an attempt to scientifically solve the problem of what type of parenting is ideal. So let's take a look at outcomes of each parenting style for children. I think you have guessed that positive parenting, authoritative parenting, gets the best results. That is, children are self-reliant, self-controlled, and have good self-esteem. They view their parents' requests and limit setting as fair, and they internalize the parents' moral code. So we've just been talking about morality. When we say internalize, what we're really saying is because the children of authoritative parents view their parents as loving and fair, they learn the rules and make them their own. Now, this is important because, as you know, we want our children to do the right thing even if we're not there. And the child of authoritative parents tends to do that. They develop good moral reasoning skills and a desire to do the right thing. We have essentially prepared them to release into the world on their own, and they're very likely to be successful. Now, permissive indifferent parents, as you probably guessed, get the worst results. Why? They're not doing either job, part of the parenting job. They're not providing love and responsiveness, and they're not setting limits. Now, sometimes these kids are admired by other kids because it looks like their parents let them do whatever they want, and they do. But that is not necessarily good, because children who have to learn every lesson themselves learn the hard way, and they take a lot of hurt and make a lot of unnecessary mistakes in the process. If we think about it, the permissive indifferent parent is a neglectful parent, and that is an illegal parenting style. It's called child neglect. Now, the authoritarian parent, the dictator, my way or the highway, long as you live under my roof. The kid says, why, Dad? And the dad says, 'cause I said so. Now, what did the child learn by I said so? Well, I'll tell you what he learned. He learned that he better behave, he better be obedient and do what he's told if the dad is there. Have you ever heard the expression, when the cat's away, the mice will play? Well, that's exactly what happens. These kids are often very obedient, and sometimes they're very successful in school. The parents require good grades. What do you think happens when they move away to college and move into a dorm and there's no dictator there to take care of them? And they begin to realize right away, I don't have to go to class, nobody cares. I don't have to study. There's dope around, I can get high, I can get drunk every night, nobody cares. Have sex with anybody who'll cooperate. And by the end of the semester, somebody's in trouble. They're experiencing drug or alcohol related problems. They may have had an arrest. Somebody may be pregnant. They may be on academic probation, and now they have to go back and explain it to the dictator. So these kids tend to be obedient in youth, but moody and unhappy, and often lack self-confidence. They have not been permitted to make decisions themselves. Every decision has been handed to them. Finally, the permissive indulgent parent. They have children who are impulsive and easily frustrated. Can you imagine why the children of permissive indulgent parents might be impulsive? If you're thinking it's because they got everything they demanded just for demanding it, you're absolutely right. Can you imagine why they might be frustrated? If you're thinking that only their parents will give them everything they want because they demand it and nobody else will, you're right again. Can you imagine marrying somebody who has been raised to believe that all they have to do is demand it and they get it? That makes for a very challenging marriage partner. All right, so we've learned 3 lessons today. And I'm going to turn the class over now to Professor Kukin, who can answer any questions you have and perhaps develop some of these themes a little bit more thoroughly.